All right, and it looks like we are live. Hello, everyone. If you guys could just pop a couple of comments in the chat so I know that you guys are watching. If someone could post a couple of comments in the chat just so I know you guys are with me, and we'll get started in a few. But before we get started, always need a little sip of coffee, get you going in the mornings. Cool. I see comments rolling in. So hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar from English for IT on how to ask better questions at work, right? Really, with this webinar, we're trying to give you the tools and examples that you need, and the explanations that you need in order for you guys to be able to ask better questions in order to get clearer answers and just be able to collaborate in a much more efficient manner with your coworkers. So I'm hoping this webinar turns out to be very interesting for you guys and also very helpful. And a lot of the things that are mentioned in this webinar are situations and scenarios that I personally encounter at work, right? I manage a team that's fairly large, and a large part of my work involves interacting with people who come to us for debugging help. And the clearer their questions are, the more able we are to help people. And this material is based off of this really excellent article called How to Ask Questions the Smart Way, right? And it's a site that looks like it's straight from the 90s, but there's a lot of really good information there. So let's get to it. Thank you all for joining. This is a webinar by English for IT, and some of you may be familiar with us. It may be the first time for some other people, but English for IT is a language and soft skills course provider and education company specifically for tech professionals worldwide, right? And we do English and Spanish and soft skills courses. We've taught over 65,000 students across Europe, Latin America, and the US. And we've been doing this for well over a decade now. So you're in good hands, right? Now that you're here on our English for IT webinar. Just a few ground rules before we get into the meat of the presentation. Feel free to be active in the chat and contribute to the discussion. I can see your comments rolling in, so feel free to ask me questions. Feel free to put your comments down, and I'll interact with you in turn. Don't spam the chat, right? It's fine to ask questions. It's fine to provide your comments, but just don't spam the chat, and no need to start swearing in the chat or anything like that. And we also have a lovely certificate for you guys. It's I believe it's a blockchain verified, really cool certificate that you can get at the end of this webinar by filling out a form. And you can find the link to that form either in the comments or in the chat itself. I believe English for IT has already provided that link. Okay. So getting into it, right? In your opinion, what's the difference between a good question and a bad question, right? I'm sure we've all been in situations where we've received good questions and bad questions, but I'd just like to get a feel for what you guys think, right? What's the difference between a good question and a bad question, in your opinion, right? Just write in the comments or in the chat, and I'm curious to hear your opinions. So Julia says a bad question is a long one that contains more than one question in the sentence. Yeah, that's a good example of a bad question, right? And what happens when you overload a question, right? If you have a very long question that has multiple parts to it, is there is a tendency for the person answering to just respond to the last thing asked, right? So if your question contains like 3 or 4 different mini questions in it, odds are only the last one is going to get an appropriate answer, right? Uh, Anastasia says a good question is one that respects boundaries and is non-judgmental. Yeah, sure. Um, that that makes sense. Um, Olga says a form or intention, and a bad question is one that is not answered. That's that, that that's a good way of putting it. And that's my general policy as well. If a question is bad, odds are it's not going to get an answer from me. Um, and Angel says good questions provide full useful information, and bad questions could be repetitive. Okay, so there's a general pattern here, right? You guys have kind of clued into the fact that good questions are structured well, right? And have some thought put behind them. And 90% of your problems with asking good questions can be solved by just putting yourself in the shoes of the listener and structuring your questions well. And we'll get to that as we go through the slides. But I've got another question for you guys before we go further. Do you feel comfortable asking questions if you don't know something? How do you guys feel about that, right? Where you're not too sure about something. Do you feel awkward asking questions? Because I know I sometimes do, right? Especially in my day job, at my day job rather. I like to do my research first before asking questions, so sometimes I don't feel all that comfortable, but I'm curious to know what you guys feel. Julia says sometimes. Yeah, sometimes. Ganma says no. All right. That's a good attitude to have. I feel it's a need to find out more. Okay. So there's some mixed opinions uh, about comfort when it comes to questions, and that's fine. So we'll cover a bunch of things during this webinar. We'll cover things you shouldn't do, right? Like I call I call this aspect 3 question mistakes that really drive people crazy, really drive Karuna crazy. We'll cover some best practices for asking smart questions, and there'll be a little bit of an interactive session where we can practice asking good questions, right? And of course, it wouldn't be a webinar without a little bit of a promo. So since you guys are all taking time out of your Thursday evening, for most of you guys, to be with me here today, we do have a special offer for you guys. You can use the code POWER to receive 35% off any Power Skills for Work course. So that's one of our premier courses that helps you learn soft skills and how to communicate better. So really good course. I encourage you to check it out, and there's a 35% promo code for you to use if it interests you. And apart from this, we also do corporate courses. So if you would like to have English for IT train your team, we can definitely work with you to come up with a plan that fits your needs. Right? That's our speciality: working with tech companies, working with organizations that work in tech, and we're very good at tailoring courses to your needs. So just get in touch with us if that's something that you'd be interested in, right? So diving straight into question mistakes that drive people crazy, right? That drive me especially crazy because I deal with them pretty commonly. The first one is this mistake that really drives me up the wall. And I'm sure you guys have experienced this. Hey, hi, can I ask you something? Can I ask a question? Right? I I call this asking permission to ask a question. And in 99.9% of cases, this is just wasting people's time, especially if you work in a distributed team, right? Especially if you work in a team that spans many different time zones where you have to work asynchronously, right? Where not everyone is online at the same time. This is a very, very bad pattern to adopt, right? Don't ask permission to ask questions, just ask the question, right? And in fact, there is a very good site that that covers this that I like to send to people. Just gonna pull it up real quick. Um, nohello.net. It's a very good site that covers why this is a bad idea. And I've gotten to the point where if someone does this, if someone asks permission to ask a question, I will send them the link to this site, right? And the reason why this is inefficient is I'm not online 24/7. And if you just say hi or can I ask you something without asking the actual question, I don't know how to prioritize your question. I don't know if it's important. I don't know what like the effort that would be required for me to solve your issue. It's just it's completely ambiguous. And so if you don't catch me immediately, right? If I'm not at my desk, or if it's 2 in the morning in my time zone, if I just read hi, I've got no idea what the problem is, and I probably won't respond, right? And a lot of people think that you should greet someone because it's polite, right? You shouldn't dive straight into the question. And my response to that is, well, you can still be polite while asking your question in the first message, right? So instead of saying, "Hi, can I ask you something?" Just be like, "Hi, Karuna, how's it going? Um, could you please tell me where I can find this document, the document we discussed," right? And this is polite, right? You've got a greeting, you're asking the person how they're doing, but you're also getting to the question, right? And that's much more effective than asking permission to ask a question. This seems like a very simple thing, right? It seems like a very, very simple thing, but I get asked this all the time, right? People almost every day at work, someone will say, "Hi, can I ask you a question?" Right? It's really, really inefficient. So don't do this. What about this? Right? What do you guys think is wrong with this? "Hi, Rick, can I draw your attention to this ticket?" Well, it's really vague, right? Can I draw your attention to this ticket? Okay, my attention is drawn, but like what are you looking for from me? Right? What's the actual ask? There is no ask here, right? There's no real um expected action for me to take, right? The recipient, in this case me, I don't know what to do with this ticket, right? My attention is drawn. Do you want me to respond to it? Do you want me to prioritize it, right? Uh, do you want me to comment on it? I don't know. And in some cases, okay, in some cases it's evident from the ticket what the person wants me to do, right? Maybe they're asking for some permission that I need to grant, maybe. But it always helps to give a call to action, as Darina said, right? Give a call to action, give the reader some idea of what it is you're expecting them to do, right? That's always a good idea, right? So instead of saying, "Hi, Rick," or "Hi, Karuna, can I draw your attention to this ticket?" you could say something like, "Hi, Rick, can I get your input on this ticket? Could you please leave a comment giving your thoughts on the strategy described in the ticket, right? Or on the feature described in the ticket. Could you just leave your thoughts?" Right? That way, I, as the person being asked, know what it is you want from me, right? Instead of something really vague. Again, this is a very common issue. Please don't do this, right? Another problem that happens fairly frequently at my day job, and this is a problem that is particularly relevant for those of you who work in the tech industry, right? The XY problem. And let me get you the link to this, right? In just a second. So here's there's a whole site on the XY problem. And essentially, the XY problem is when you ask for help, um, where you have a particular issue and you're asking about what you think the solution is rather than describing the problem that you're trying to solve, right? And I think we've got some examples here. So, for example, instead of saying, how can I filter my spreadsheet to only show active clients, which is what you want, like that's the problem you're trying to solve, instead, what people uh, in certain cases tend to do is they will ask for help for a solution that they think would work instead of describing the problem, right? So instead of saying, how can I filter my spreadsheet to only show active clients, they'll say something like, how do I remove blank rows in Excel, right? So that's an example of an XY problem. Another one would be, after I deploy code, the code changes don't seem to take effect right away. What could be the issue, right? That's the actual problem. But instead of asking that, right, you can have scenarios where the user will ask about a solution that they think would work, right? How do I deploy the server, restart the server rather, every time I deploy? That's another example of an XY problem, right? You're not explaining what the actual issue is. You're trying to get help for a solution that may or may not work, right? And the reason why this is dangerous is when you have a problem, the solution that you have in your mind on how to solve it may not necessarily be the right solution. And if you don't state clearly the problem that you're trying to solve, you're not really leveraging the collective intelligence of your team on the problem, right? You're missing out on a whole lot of problem solving from your team by describing a very uh, limited solution instead of the actual problem, right? And this happens fairly frequently, especially with more junior engineers. So my mid-level and junior engineers do this very often, right? The more senior engineers kind of understand that it's usually more useful to describe the problem, what you're seeing, and what you think should be the actual behavior versus trying to get immediate help on the solution, right? So try not to do this, right? So those were three major question asking issues that I tend to see in real life, right? The asking about XY problems, vague questions, and permission to ask a question. I would say those are the top three mistakes people make when asking questions. But let's talk about some best practices, right? So we discussed all the things you shouldn't do. Let's now focus a bit more on what you should, right? So again, we want to avoid vague questions, right? So the app isn't working. Can you help me? There's something wrong with X. super, super vague. The only thing that I get out of that is something's broken, right? Instead, try to put relevant details, right? After the latest update, the app crashes when I click submit on the login form and I see a 401 in the console, right? And I know there's a lot of techies in the chat here. Which one would be more useful? My app's not working. Any ideas? Or we had an update and the app crashes when I click submit and I see a 401 in the console, right? Which do you think is going to help you solve the problem quicker or have your problem be solved quicker, right? When you add more details, you give your team more things to go on, right? So you're letting the team know that an update has happened. So maybe there was something in the update that caused this. Um, you're mentioning that it crashes when you hit submit on the login form. Okay, so now the dev teams can maybe focus um, on the actual login logic, right? Gives them a place to start looking. And a 401 error in the console, that's also a really good information for a developer, right? Why is it getting a 401, right? So uh, you want to have a good balance. You want to strike a good balance between super vague and a lot of unnecessary detail, right? And that's, I believe, the next thing that we'll discuss, right? So um, there, like I said, there's a fine line between providing enough detail and data dumping, right? So a data dump is when you just dump everything on the user, right? Um, so in the example here, we have, hi, I forward you the email thread with the client. What solutions can we offer to their concerns? I wouldn't quite call that a data dump, but you're expecting the user um, to go through the entire email thread and respond instead of giving a very clear expectation of what it is that you want, right? So the better option would be, hi, I forward you the client's email thread. Their main concern is the delay in delivery and the lack of tracking updates. Could we offer a revised timeline and some proactive status updates, right? So here in the kind of correct example, we can see that the person asking or the person who wrote the second example, they've summarized the email, right? They've highlighted the main points. The main concerns are delay in delivery and lack of tracking updates, and they've kind of proposed a solution, right? Can we give them a revised timeline, and can we give proactive status updates, right? So instead of just giving someone raw data and telling them to figure it out, right, make their job a little bit easier. Um, Formulating your question before asking. This again is a habit that I've noticed where people tend to give what's known as a train of thought analysis of something, right? Exactly what's on their mind, they'll just type it out instead of thinking through and structuring a question well, right? So for example, in this wrong example here, you can see them just state things without clearly structuring it, right? Hey, quick question. I'm working on the client dashboard task. I'm not sure if I'm supposed to use the latest KPIs or just use last quarter's. Also, I think the data pipeline was updated recently. Not sure if it affects it. So it's not really clear what exactly is going on, right? Like it's not really clear what the problem is versus the correct option, which is, or the more correct option, which states, hi, I'm updating the client dashboard and I want to confirm, should I include the latest KPIs or stick with last quarter's metrics? I also saw that there was a recent data pipeline update, just checking if this changes anything, right? So you can see the second option appears a lot more professional, right? It's structured better. There's a very clear question, right? Should I include latest KPIs or stick with the last quarter's metrics? And there's a raised concern. I saw there was a recent data pipeline update, just checking if this changes anything. You're just mentioning your concern, but the main question is, should I use the latest KPIs or last quarter's metrics? And in fact, to make this even better, like an even more effective question, I would wait for the person's response before asking about the data pipeline update, right? Just so that I'm not having two areas of concern in the same message. But in most cases, this would be fine, right? You can tell it's been a lot, some thought has been put into it, right? Um, Describe the goal and not the step that you want to take to get to it, right? And again, this is the XY problem that we discussed earlier. This is how you avoid the XY problem. So instead of saying, "Oh, how do I use regex to extract this string?" Right? You're describing a process versus your intended result. Ask, "I'm trying to pull out the user's ID from a URL string. Is regex the best way, or is there a cleaner method?" Right? And that's a much better question because you're describing what it is that you want, right? You want the user's ID. And maybe regex isn't the right solution, right? Maybe getting the user's ID, you can pull it from some other data source, right? Maybe you don't need the user's ID at all, right? And if you just ask, how do I use regex to extract this string, you're not really getting help on the true issue. And in fact, I would extend the correct answer further to describe what it is that you're using the user ID for. Right? For example, oh, I'm working on a feature that ties a user to a product, and I want to extract the user ID from this string. How do I go about doing that, or is it even the right thing to do? Right? I would go one step back and describe the thing that I'm trying to do with the user's ID, right? Does that make sense? I'm going to assume yes, since the chat is on a little bit of a delay. And of course, it's always good to show gratitude, so remember to say thanks, right? Um, One thing that I've also noticed is a lot of non-native speakers of English like to say thanks in advance. And I tend to avoid using thanks in advance because when you say thanks in advance, you are in a way saying that they are going to do it. You know, there's like a little bit of pressure behind that statement. Thanks in advance sets an expectation that the person is going to do it. And in some scenarios, maybe that's what you want, right? You want to subtly emphasize that this isn't a request, it's a requirement, right? Then saying thanks in advance, I guess, would work. But you should also you should just keep in mind that when you say thanks in advance, you're essentially setting an expectation that they're going to do it. It's a very subtle expectation, but you're thanking them in advance. Like in your head, they've already done it. You're thanking them in advance. So instead of saying thanks in advance, I would just say thank you. It's a lot more neutral, right? So, on to a little bit more of a practical part of our webinar, right? Where I'm going to give you questions and or I'm going to give you scenarios rather, and you guys can give me examples of how you would ask the question in a smart way. So our first scenario is you're trying to preview a video file for a client presentation, but it's not playing correctly on your laptop, right? So how would you get help? How would you ask for help in this scenario? Go ahead and put it in the comments or uh, in the chat, depending on what platform you're on, and we will discuss it together. Will a recording of the webinar be available? I believe so, but someone from English for IT is going to confirm that in the chat. I can hear them typing right now. Julia says, I'd use the same sentence that I can see on the screen, plus we'll add a call to action. Hmm. Do you mean that you'll say, I'm not, but the video is not playing correctly on my laptop. Could you please help me? I'm not sure what the call to action would be. The answer is yes, the webinar is being recorded and will be made available. But if somebody could give uh, their opinion on how they would ask a question in this scenario, that would be very helpful. The thing about webinar chats is I can't actually see if anyone's typing, so I'm not sure if anyone is actually attempting to answer the question or if you're all very shy. So I'm going to give it another minute, and if there aren't any answers, I'll give it I'll give you an example of how I would ask this question. Bit of a sneak peek. So how I'd ask it, since I don't see anything in the comments, is, hey, I'm trying to open the promo video on my laptop. It keeps freezing halfway through. Could you check if it works on your end? And if it does, maybe resend a different version. Nastasia says, describe what the problem is and then what the solution you see and are trying to apply. Yeah, that's a very good way of getting around the XY problem, right? You describe the problem and possibly the solution instead of just asking for help for the solution that you think is going to work. So that's a very good point. Moving on to the next scenario, like let's say you're working on a shared document and you want to make sure that tone and structure are aligned, right? Because as you all know, different people have different writing styles, and if multiple people are working on the same document, you want to make sure that the tone and structure is aligned, right? Is consistent. So how would you ask that question? How would you guys get your team in alignment on the document? Any thoughts there? Honestly, I remember the first time that Google Docs came out with the ability for multiple people to edit the same document, and I thought it was absolute magic. The fact that I could see someone type on the same document was just mind-blowing at the time. It's kind of an not quite related to asking questions. I just since we're talking about collaborating on shared documents, that's definitely a feature that I found really impressive when it came out. Okay, I don't see anything in the chat, so I'll say you can keep it really simple. Quick check-in. Are we leaning more formal or conversational with this section? Or, hey guys, what do we think the tone should be of this document? Right? Are we going for something a bit more formal? Are we going for something more conversational, more casual? What are your thoughts? Simply speaking says, I would go with a question to verify if we're all on the same page and review with them. Yeah, fair enough. So a question to verify would be something like, okay, guys, so for this document, our target market, our target audience rather, is going to be IT professionals, right? So are we going to write it with a semi-formal tone that fits the industry? And if so, who's going to take which sections, right? Just really straightforward. You're asking um, a a clear question. You've framed it well, and you've explained why it is that you're asking, or why it is that you're proposing a particular tone, right? Because the tech industry is known to be not a super formal industry, it's kind of semi-formal. So let's go with that. How about with planning? You're preparing for an upcoming client presentation and want to confirm logistics. How would you ask that question? How would you confirm logistics? Oh, sneak peek. So I would say something like, do we have a final version of the deck? Are there any last minute tweaks I should hold off on for before updating slide 10, right? Or in terms of logistics, um, do we know at what stage we should start the presentation, right? You can be really creative with these scenarios. The whole idea is to develop your ability to ask questions that are not very short, that have the requisite detail for them to be effective. What about feedback? How do you guys generally ask for feedback? Right? You've just wrapped up a draft of something, or of a pitch document, let's say, and you want someone's input before sending it out. You want them to check it out, make sure that it's all grammatically correct, or if the content is correct. How would you ask for help that way, right? Or for that particular task? Well, you could keep it kind of casual while still stating what it is you want. So, for example, you could say, "Well, I've drafted the intro and summary of this document. Would you mind giving it a look?" Right? And in English, in conversational English, instead of saying, "Would you mind giving it a look?" you can also conversationally say, "Mind giving it a look." Right? So these two statements are the same. Right? It's just more conversational. Mind giving it a look? I'm curious if the tone and flow feel right to you, right? And so why is this a good question? You've stated what it is you've done, right? You've drafted the intro and summary. You're asking, you're very clearly asking what it is you want the other person to do. You want the other person to give it a look, and you are emphasizing what specifically you have concerns about, right? The tone and the flow. Darina says, I've formed a message for a potential client. Can you please check if it's not too salesy? Yeah, that's a very good example, right? You've formed the message. The only feedback I would say is form the message is not very idiomatic. Like a native speaker wouldn't say I've formed a message. It doesn't sound that natural. So instead of formed a message, um, I, as a native speaker, would say something like, I've drafted a message for a potential client, or I've drafted an intro email for a potential client. Can you please check and let me know what you think? I'm worried it might be a bit too salesy, right? So that's how I would say it, but your option or your example works pretty well. The only feedback I would have is form the message sounds slightly unnatural, but it's not a big deal. Like you could totally run with that and it would be fine. Um, do we have any other anybody else want to take a stab at how you would um, ask a question like this? Permission to ask. uh, yeah, honestly, asking permission to ask a question is like my number one pet peeve at work, right? And the term pet peeve, for those of you who don't know, pet peeve is something minor or inconsequential that you find highly annoying, right? So getting asking permission to ask a question really is a pet peeve of mine. I find it very irritating because it's a very obvious waste of time for both the person asking and the person receiving the question. Anyways, those were a couple of scenarios just to kind of get your brain juices flowing on how to ask questions well. I want to reiterate that we have a promo code for you guys. You can use code POWER to receive 35% off any of our Power Skills for Work courses. So if you enjoyed my webinar here today, you can check it out. And there's a lot of really useful content there that will help you really accelerate your English skills. And we have a link in the chat. These courses are really customized and they're really tailored to tech professionals. We've got 3 different packages available, and a really cool thing is you get a blockchain verified certificate at the end of the course, right? So you can put it on LinkedIn and show that you've gone through training, that you take your career development seriously. Simply speaking, says, I would say quick question and be keen on the problem. I think you're referring to um, uh, how to avoid asking permission to ask a question. And yeah, you can say something like, hey, quick question, and then ask a question. What you want to avoid is just saying hi and are you online and just leaving it like that, right? That's what you want to avoid. So simply speaking, your example of saying, hey, quick question, and then giving your question, that's perfectly fine, right? the whole idea is to make sure that question is being asked instead of you asking permission to ask the question. Um, that is essentially the end of the webinar in terms of all the material that we have to cover, and the scenarios. But if you guys have any questions for me about asking questions or about English in general, feel free to pop them in the chat, and we can have a little bit of a back and forth here before we say goodbye. So I'll be here hanging out for a bit. So feel free to ask me some questions, and I might even tell you if they're questions that are well formulated or not. So I know this webinar was a little bit rapid fire, but did you guys find it useful? Well, thank you, Olga, for joining. And thanks, Simply Speaking. It was nice. Well, I'm glad that you found it nice. Julia asks, how to ask for feedback in order to receive constructive feedback. So the thing about asking for feedback is I would apply the same principles that I do to asking questions to asking for feedback, right? So, and that's to be specific as to what sort of feedback you're looking for. So, for example, um, let's say I've been working in a new role for some time now, and I'd like to get an idea of how well I'm doing, right, in this new role. I could ask my manager something like, hey, I've been in role for about 6 months now, and I'd like to get a temperature check as to how you think I'm doing in terms of satisfying the needs of the role. Like, do you think that I am performing my job function in a way that satisfies the requirements of the company? Where do you think I have room to grow? Essentially formulating in specific terms what it is, like what sort of feedback that you're looking for. And I'm gonna write it out. Right. So for example, if if you're new to a role and you'd like to get feedback from your manager, you can ask something like, hey, um, like name, I've been in role now for about 6 months now, and I just like to get a pulse check on how you feel I'm performing. Am I uh, am I satisfied the needs of my role? And where do you think my growth areas lie? Right? Something like that. And I guess YouTube comments can't be that long, so chopped it up a little bit, but it's fine. Nat N asks, what kind of wording and questions do you like the most? It's an interesting question. I can't say that I have a preference for wording in questions. I like when people ask questions that are written well, like well structured, grammatically well constructed, and um and show that some thought has been put into them, right? Those are the questions that I like, and those are the questions that I'm more likely to jump on, where it's obvious to me that the person asking has put effort into solving their issue, right? Questions that describe, because I'm in a technical role, right? So usually the questions I get are technical ones. Questions where the user has described their problem, like what it is they're trying to solve, the steps that they have taken to solve the problem. If it's a technical problem, uh, examples of what commands they've run, right? What errors they're seeing. Those sorts of details really help me out when it comes to people asking me for help. Another thing that wasn't in this slide deck, but I've just thought of it as we've been discussing technical questions is please, 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 if you're in a technical role and you need help debugging something, under no circumstances should you send a screenshot of an error message, right? Like or of a terminal, right? Please don't send screenshots of terminal output, right? Copy and paste the actual uh, error that you're getting, right? Copy and paste URLs. Don't send screenshots of error text in terminals, right? That's something that I absolutely hate because I can't. It makes me have to type more, right? Because and I'm telling you this honestly as someone who's worked in the tech industry for over a decade. One of the first things that I do when someone reports an error is I'm going to Google the error code, right? And if you make it difficult for me, if you send a screenshot, and which makes it difficult for me to extract what it is you're seeing, my desire to help you drops by like 25%, right? So please don't send screenshots. Please actually send error text. Simply speaking says you cannot come with a no try to resolve problem. It is worthless. Um, are you saying that uh, you should come already sort of prepared, like you should describe the steps that you've taken to fix a particular problem? Is that what you're describing? Yeah, I mean, within reason, right? Like, I feel that people should attempt to fix their problems, but sometimes you run into issues that you have no control over and you're just seeing symptoms, right? For example, the if my company's VPN goes down, there's a very limited set of things that I can do to bring it back up, right? There's a limited set of things that I can try to get it working. And I can describe those, right? Like, oh, maybe I checked that my password is valid. I checked that my home internet works. But there's like a limited set of things that you can actually do. Um, Simply speaking says, unless you are an end user in IT. Yeah, like if you're an end user, then you just describe what it is that you're seeing. Nat asks, thank you for, or says, thank you for your answer. What formulations do you consider to be the most effective in questions? That's quite a broad question. So I'll say in general, questions that are specific and targeted are the most effective, right? Whereas someone isn't overloading a single question with many like mini questions, right? That way, the very specific question can receive a very specific answer. Um, Also, if it's a technical issue that the person is asking about, showing error messages, showing what they've tried, right? Showing the actual commands that they've run, right? If it's a sysadmin type problem, actually typing out what questions you've, uh, sorry, not what questions, what commands you've run on your terminal helps a lot, right? Because then I can see all the steps that you've done. I can see the output that you got. And in a lot of cases, that really does help out, right? Any other final questions before we wrap up? Nope. All right. In that case, we will call it a day. Thank you all very much for joining me on this Thursday morning or evening or afternoon, depending where in the world you are. I hope that you found this content useful. Um, Julia says, curious how many times you've said question today. Way too many times. Um, way too many times. Um, and again, I hope that this content has helped you guys out and helps you think a little bit about how you formulate things before you actually send them to your or before you actually ask people. Right? Um, cool. In that case, call it a webinar. Thanks, everyone. Have a good rest of your week, and I'll see you at the next English for IT webinar. Please make sure to check out the Power Skills for Work course, 35% off with code POWER. We don't just do Power Skills for Work courses. If you work for a company and if you need English training, feel free to reach out to us, and we can customize a program specifically for your org. We also offer one-on-one sessions. Essentially, any sort of English or soft skills training, just reach out to us, and I'm sure we'll have a solution for you. Thanks, and I'll see you when I see you. Bye.